Welcome to Research to Practice, the Inclusion of Special Needs Students. This video PowerPoint presentation is going to discuss the use of inclusion practices along with evidence-based practices that support inclusion practices. So I want to start off by discussing first a Bible verse that I think goes perfectly with this discussion. That is Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. I think this Bible verse is perfect for this discussion, as we are not called to do what is easy. We are called to do what is right. And a lot of times, inclusion is a difficult thing for a lot of special education students, and a lot of times the use of evidence-based practices is not simple or quick to find. So having that diligence, knowing that you are to do what God commanded you and that you are to be transformed, I think is an important aspect of any job, but I think it's perfect for the use of inclusion and evidence-based practice, to know that you are not to conform to what everyone else does, but to be transformed and to know that you are finding what is good and what is acceptable and what is imperfect, not only for God, but for your job, to show that you have perfection and best foot forward when it comes to educational practices, knowing that you are doing it for the Lord. So let's first look at what is inclusion in itself. Inclusion is typically seen as the students that have disabilities and students that do not have disabilities being in the same classroom together. This can be both for academic or social aspects of learning, as long as the students are together in a general education setting. So typical inclusion is any general education setting where you have both special education students and general education students together in the classroom. Special education services are given to students with inclusion through the use of co-teaching. This is not always the way that it happens, but typically if you're going to use inclusion and your goal is to keep that student with their general education peers as much as possible, you service that student through their least restrictive environment, which is part of the IEP. You do that in the co-taught classroom. So their least restrictive environment for students in special education says what is the least restrictions that we can put on a student to be able to meet their needs. So not all times can that be full inclusion. Sometimes it just doesn't work for that student. Sometimes they need more intensive interventions, and they cannot happen in the classroom. So full inclusion doesn't happen. We would like it to be happening as much as possible. We feel that special education students get a great benefit out of being included in their classroom with their generation peers as much as possible. So having resource and self-contained classrooms should be one of the last resorts for your least restrictive environment, because those do restrict the abilities of the students by putting those restraints on them. So special education teachers going into the classroom in a co-teach setting is one of the main ways that they service students with special education disabilities in inclusion settings. And aspects of that are collaborative planning, which is very difficult for special education teachers, mostly because their planning time, if they get one, doesn't always line up with the general education teachers that they're working with. And so collaborative planning has to be very creative, and sometimes you have to sacrifice some things in order to make it work so that you can plan accordingly to have the best effect in the classroom when you're teaching together. You need to make sure that you're having a positive working relationship. If you don't get along with the people that you're co-teaching with, it's going to be very hard for you to make that environment an effective one for the students. And you need to make sure that you agree upon the roles and responsibilities that each of you will take in that inclusion setting. So then what are evidence-based practice? So if inclusion is putting the kids in the classroom, both special ed and general ed classes together in a general education setting, then evidence-based practices for that are what? So first of all, evidence-based practices are proven effective through the rigorous guidance measures that have been repeated on numerous studies. So not only do they have to have done a research study, it has to have met certain criteria of a research study in order to be evidence-based. And then on top of that, it needs to have been repeated through numerous studies. Doing it one time is not make it evidence-based. Just because it works one time with one student does not make it an evidence-based practice. You want to see it being repeated and effective in multiple ways. So evidence-based practices have to prove to be have a meaningful impact on student outcomes. So the outcomes for that student, it has to be meaningful in some way. It should impact them. So if your research may work, but does it have a long-term meaningful impact for that student? If it doesn't have a meaningful impact for the student, then it cannot be evidence-based. So that's another criteria. So it has to meet the criteria, which is about reliability, and making sure that you're incorporating all the research standards into the research. Then you have to have that research being repeated by others to show that they can also duplicate the outcomes. Then you need to make sure that those outcomes are meaningfully impacted for the students. This can be very, very, very tricky for special education teachers because evidence-based practices are not a one-size-fits-all model for special education students. Special education teachers are required to do individualized education plans, IEPs, and those are individualized for a reason because each student is different, each student has unique needs, and so therefore finding evidence-based practices that work with everybody is a tricky situation because a lot of times evidence-based practices do not meet the needs of more than one student. So it can be very, very tricky for a special education teacher. You have to have a lot of evidence-based practices in your wheelhouse because just because that evidence-based practice works with one student doesn't mean it might work with the other student. So you have to be able to have multiple practices that you can rely on to meet the needs of your students in the classroom. So let's take a moment to talk about the history of inclusion. Inclusion was first mentioned in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Now, this was not special education law, but this act at the time was trying to make it a more inclusive environment for all students. It was post-war, and so there are a lot of things going into that law that made it where they wanted to include more. They wanted to have more men and women and going into sciences and trying to include them in a much more rigorous educational environment. But that was the start of the inclusion model, and from there you had the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which was in 1975, and this was specifically meant for students with special needs to be included in the schools and classrooms with their general education peers. So that was when it was first came about for special education students. And since that law has been reauthorized as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in 1990 and then in 2004. 2004 is our current version. It was a name change. It's still Public Law 94-142. But it went from Education for All Handicapped Children Act to the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And through that act is where you get the 13 disability categories and then the use of the least restrictive environment for those and individualized education plans. So through the use of all of that in that act, you get how you would incorporate inclusive practices. Then President Bush put in a No Child Left Behind Act, which did a lot of changing for special education teacher roles when that came about, and how licensure worked and who could teach what and where and when. And it was a scary time for a lot of teachers at that time because the old school way was the special education teacher was just trained in special education. But with this No Child Left Behind, in order to be able to teach some of the classes and things that special education teachers were teaching, they wanted them to have dual certifications. They wanted to have both an elementary license and a special education license, and that wasn't the case for a lot of teachers. So I know that time was very difficult for a lot of teachers because of that law. But that was over in 2015, and in its place was Obama's Every Student Succeeds Act that has come into practice. And then that is where you really got the emphasis on evidence-based practices. Now, it wasn't put in that they were absolutely required, but it was emphasized that these were the practices that you should be looking at for classrooms to use those evidence-based practices. And then, of course, you've had some court cases that have been impactful for special education, inclusion, and for evidence-based practices. And one of those was called Andrew versus Douglas County School District in 2017. And while Andrew didn't win the case, some of the outcomes of that ruling did impact special education. So a quote from the actual Andrew case, and it was that IDEA, which is Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, so IDEA requires an educational program that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress that is appropriate in light of the child's circumstance. So regardless of the child's circumstances, their disability or their behavioral functioning, we need to do more than just the minimum. We need to go and make sure that we can show that students are making progress. Okay, it's our job as special education teachers and general education teachers that have those students, that we need to make sure that we are reasonably calculating ways in which students can make progress on goals, on academic and social areas in the school setting. So do teachers use evidence-based practices? An article found that after surveying 1,500 educators, that only 34% of those educators had a high confidence level in using evidence-based practices. And when in a recent encounter with one of the new special education teachers in my school system, discussing evidence-based practices and the use of them with our students, she questioned what that was. What do you mean by evidence-based practice? What is that? I mean, how do you know if a practice is evidence-based? And that was a little concerning to me, knowing that pre-service teachers are coming in and getting jobs in the school systems and not even having heard of evidence-based practices, or even having a few evidence-based practices in their belts to be able to pull out and try to use with students. So that is something that obviously I feel it needs to be addressed. But the article went on to say that they have 3 major changes that they think would be effective in getting better access for teachers for evidence-based practices. One of those was a range of research programs across subject areas and grade levels. So at this time, they feel that there's not even enough evidence-based practices for subject areas. So like that's including all aspects of English language arts, math, science, social studies, the related arts subject areas, and or grade levels. They don't have enough to just distinguish like pre-K through 12th grade, the different research programs that they need. They think that we need to have more evidence-based practices, so more of that rigorous studies that have proven outcomes for students. We need to have practitioner-friendly access to programs and practices. So a lot of times you have evidence-based practices, but you don't have access to them, or it's expensive curriculum or implementation for it, and that's not something that overworked teachers in today's schools have time. So finding a way to get those more easily accessed programs to the teachers would help benefit in actually getting teachers to do evidence-based practices in their classrooms. And the last one is to better government policies that encourage adopting research-based approaches. As we said earlier with the Every Student Succeeds Act, that it's being emphasized that they should be used and that you should seek out evidence-based practices, but there's no actual government policy requiring the use of evidence-based practices at this time. So do teachers use inclusion? So we know that we're struggling right now with evidence-based practices, but how do they actually use inclusion? So many inclusion practices are not most beneficial for students with disabilities. At this time, a lot of the practices being used for inclusion are a one teacher, one assist model, or a one teacher, one observe model. And those are not effective ways of teaching or co-teaching in a classroom. It's not an effective way to have progress made for students with disabilities when you're not really working with them, you're not hands-on with them, when you're just assisting whatever the teacher is doing, or when you're just observing the classroom as the teacher is doing the lessons. Those are not evidence-based. But they did find that there were a few evidence-based practices for inclusion and co-teaching, and those were team teaching, where the teachers stand together and they're both doing the lesson, teaching aspects of it or showing it in different ways. Station teaching, where they each take a station as students rotate through. And parallel teaching. Parallel teaching is splitting the classes into two different groups, and one teacher teaching that group and then another teacher teaching the other group. Now, most of the time these are groups based on need areas, and it doesn't necessarily mean that a special education teacher has to have that low area all the time, although they tend to be more experts in that field. But you pick a group and you split the kids in a way that, and then you teach the same topic together at the same time in the classroom, but separated. So evidence-based categories. These are the things that they've found, research articles that went through and looked at inclusion and looked at evidence-based practices for inclusion and how they were separated. Now, I had mentioned that there are 13 categories that are recognized under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And of those 13 categories, they found that there was evidence-based inclusion studies for those students with autism, students with emotional and behavior disorders, and students with learning disabilities. That is 3 out of 13 categories. So there is not a lot of evidence-based practices when it comes to inclusion and other disability areas. So I know that most of the students that are serviced with disabilities are students with learning disabilities, so that is great that we have access to evidence-based practices for students with learning disabilities, who are most likely to be the ones that are in an inclusion setting. But I think it would be beneficial, especially for those students that maybe need to be in a self-contained setting for some of the time, like those ones with moderates or severe disabilities, but could be in an inclusive setting for some of the time using evidence-based practices. But there's not a lot of literature out there right now discussing evidence-based practices that could be inclusive. They did find that there was evidence-based practices at every grade level, all the way from pre-K through elementary, middle, and high school. So they did find adequate evidence of inclusive evidence-based practices in those grade levels. So that was across the board. That was nice. They found that there was evidence-based practices of inclusion for English language arts, science, and social studies, but they did not have that for math. They didn't find specific inclusive math evidence-based practices to be efficient, so that is something that is an area of need. And they did find adequate articles about social skills. Now, social skills areas of inclusive I think are great, and I think that would help some of those moderate severe students that more self-contained get into an inclusion using some of these social skills evidence-based practices in inclusion, but it's just not happening, and there's not like that triangulation of data between how you would use inclusive social skills with moderate severe students in inclusive settings to make that work. So that is an area of need that I think still needs to be met, but I think it's great that we do have practices for that majority of our students as they have learning disabilities, and we do have evidence-based practices for all the different grade levels going from pre-K through high school. So there are out there for teachers in the classrooms. And once again, I said that one of the best types of co-teaching inclusive practices are those parallel teaching models, the team teaching models, or the station teaching models. We need to get away from the use of one teacher, one assist. That's a waste of special education teachers' expertise, and one teacher, one observe. You're not able to help students make adequate progress if you're just in there observing them. You need to be more hands-on working with those students. in the classroom in order for them to make progress. So thank you for being part of this PowerPoint. I hope that you were able to find adequate evidence of inclusive practices that need to be used, evidence-based inclusive practices need to be used in special education. If you have any questions, here's my contact information, and here's a list of the references that were used for getting information to prove evidence-based practices in an inclusive setting. Thank you very much.